Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing a statement that Donald Trump made not too long ago, and I'm going to quote him exactly. He said, "Top people in the Pentagon are not happy with me because they want to do nothing but fight wars, so all those companies that make bombs and make planes and make everything else stay happy," end quote. Now, I'm going to add to that a Brown University report, which I feel is quite connected to that issue, that at least 37 million people have been displaced globally ever since the two-decade-long war on terror was begun by the United States around the world. Now, even Brown University says that figure is, in fact, a conservative figure, and the real number could, in fact, range between 48 and 59 million. Now, the majority of the displaced are in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Philippines, Libya, Syria. It's huge, right? The range of this and the levels that we're seeing. The university goes on to say that the scale of the displacement likely reaches levels that were only, in fact, seen in World War II or in the aftermath of World War II as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Nina Burleigh, who is a journalist. She's written for Newsweek, NBC, Rolling Stone, Medium.com. She's also a best-selling author, most recently of Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women. She's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us today from Cardiff is Dr. Kaunert, who is a professor, of policing and security, and is also the director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Kerstin and Nina, thank you both for your time today. Nina, let me start with you. Let's start with Trump's statement first, right? Do you think that there is some truth to what he has said there about the fact that there is a lot of influence, at the very least, of arms companies on U.S. policies?
Well, his own defense secretary was the top lobbyist for Raytheon, which is one of the major weapons makers on this planet, for 10 years. He was the Raytheon. He was such a good lobbyist that he won awards as one of the most effective lobbyists in Washington. So that right there tells you where the Trump administration stands on the military-industrial complex. But he hits a chord when he says this, because no politicians other than Bernie Sanders are talking about this and have been talking about this for years. The Democrats have ceded the ground to the Republicans on this. If a Republican were to speak up, none of them do, because they're all on board with it. So for him to say, even to step his foot into this area, excites Americans, because Americans are tired of the endless wars. The average American, but especially the Americans living in communities that gave their young men and young women to the military, volunteered because they didn't have college prospects, volunteered for the military, or volunteered because after 9/11 they thought it was the right thing to do, went off and saw their children die, and then their country, the Treasury, emptied out to fight these wars, are upset about it, and there's nobody speaking for them. And he's a marketer and a brander, and he knows this instinctively, so he tosses a bone to them. And no coincidence that it's right around election time that we're having this discussion. So it's effective, but is it reflective of any kind of actual action? Well, he has been averse to sending ground troops in, and he hasn't started a war. I mean, we all kind of expected when he got elected that something terrible was going to happen in foreign policy in terms of violence, and he hasn't actually started a war. So, but it's a sad statement that we have to say he hasn't started a war as a plus to his administration, given the history of presidents past.
Kerstin, what are Christian thoughts on this? Because, we can obviously bring in even the UK, where you're sitting, right, into this, because it's not like it's only been the US that's fought in the war on terror or in wars around the world. The UK has been involved in many of them, supporting the US, especially when it came to the Iraq war, for example, and others. Do you feel like it's sort of like the same issue in the UK as well? Well, it feels like there are a lot of arms companies which have undue influence over policy making and these quote unquote endless wars.
Thanks for having me on the program. I think there's a couple of interesting things here. One, just to say something about Trump's statement, because in a way it shouldn't surprise us. He's always going on about, the deep state that prevents him from doing all that sort of thing, deep state that prevents him from cleaning up the mess and the swamp in Washington and not whatnot. So in a sense, it's not a surprising statement. I think it's an interesting timing for that statement because it comes at the back of, a number of denigrating statements, pejorative statements that he'd been making about American war heroes recently. So I think what he's trying to do is clearly change the discourse that from a president that was talking negatively about American soldiers to one that wants to bring them home. So there's that branding exercise. But in terms of obviously the larger point that you're raising in terms of do military companies have influence over policy? And I think that is probably something that we will see in the United States. That is something that we see in the UK. That is something that we see in Russia. That is something that we see in China. That is not something that should surprise us, particularly, of course, that those companies that benefit from massive investment should have some influence over policy. I think that is something that is unfortunately the reality of the world that we see today.
I wanted to add voice to the conversation. We're now joined by Dr. Reza Yeganehshakib, who is a faculty member at Santa Monica College in California. He's a history professor and geopolitics and energy analyst. He's currently joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Reza, thank you for your time today. Let's talk about the war on terror, if we can, Reza, because, the Brown University report has said at least 37 million have been displaced globally during and after and as a result of this war on terror, this 2-decade-long war on terror ever since 9/11. And it says that, in fact, that's a conservative estimate, that the real numbers could be between 48 and 59 million. What are your thoughts on that? Because it seems like when you're in the U.S. or in these other countries that are a part of this war on terror, there's sort of this bubble, right, where you don't realize the kind of impact that this is having overseas.
Thanks for having me here. First of all, everything which is happening now in Washington, D.C. is aligned with the Trump campaign. Therefore, Trump says one thing, but his actions during this time that he has been in the office is something else. As you mentioned, the war on terror actually were continued. Trillions of dollars of U.S. taxpayers' money was flushed down this drain, and nothing really happened. Still, the U.S. troops are not decreasing, but actually are increasing. We see the presence of the U.S. troops in Syria. Actually, that happened during the Trump era. The U.S. troops are still in Iraq, although he promised to withdraw from Iraq and leave it for the Iraqis. Still, the U.S. troops are there. And he never actually ever hesitated to initiate any basically act, even very provocative act of war, which fits his campaign. For example, he ordered the assassination of anti-ISIS Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. This was a terrorist act, actually, which he committed. He's trying to appease the people, and basically he's trying to divert the attention of the American people from his incapability to address the issues, the crisis which is in now as a result of coronavirus outbreak and the protests.
I wonder, as it's put to Reza, it's important to remember, right, that at the receiving end of the war on terror have also been a lot of innocent people who have been displaced. I mean, in this specific case, at Brown University report, we're talking about the displacement of many, many, many millions of people, right? And even in where I'm sitting right now in Pakistan, the Prime Minister has spoken of that, and he said that the world needs to understand the kind of impact that has had on these respective countries. Do you think it's important for the American public or the British public, or whichever countries are involved in the war on terror, to actually appreciate the fact that at the end of this, the receiving end of this, are also humans, and many of them, for the large part, are actually innocent in this?
Of course, it's important for Americans to understand that, and unfortunately, the way that the political class has responded to it is, at least the Trump administration, and the election of Trump was on a project of nativism, of building a wall, of keeping people out. And, that's one of the great disgusting ironies of the whole war on terror is that, we've displaced 60 million people, most of them pouring into Europe. And very, very few allowed into the United States. And those people have suffered while we have a president and a political class screaming about rapists coming over our borders, terrorists coming in, and basically locking down and making the United States into a fortress. So, I don't know what to say about that. Other than that, it's disgusting, and it's one of the great ironies that they've been able to pull that off. The problem is the American people are not. I mean, everyone in this country who reads the news and watches the news and is informed understands that these wars on terror have displaced enormous amounts of people. But what I think gets lost is, you start to see the influx, let's say, of Syrians across the water into Italy, and then the whole issue of Europe trying to deal with these enormous numbers of people coming in. You see that, and the reason for it is not in every single article and in every single video explained. So it's easy for these.
Nina, I'm going to interrupt you. I do apologize. Just quickly running out of time. The clock is getting the best of us. I just wanted to, with due apologies to you, ask Kerstin and Reza for their final comments before I let both of them go. Just under a minute, if both of you can, to each of you. Kerstin first. On this issue of displacing all these people, the effect that this has on innocent people around the world, this war on terror, that's sort of self-defeating, right? Because the war on terror was meant to, I would imagine, win hearts and minds and ensure no one would ever be radicalized. But this sort of seems to push people into desperation, doesn't it, Kerstin?
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely a catastrophe in terms of what is happening, and I think this is not something that one should desire or want. But one thing that I wanted to point out, of course, when we talk about Syria and a lot of the streams that are coming from Syria, that a lot of the military troops that are behind some of those streams are Russian troops, in fact. So a lot of the people that are being persecuted from Syria are in fact persecuted by Russian troops. So I think it is something that is very important to underline, that it isn't just an American war, that it is something that the Russians are also fighting, and increasingly it is a global conflict of a larger magnitude that involves more than just Western countries.
And Reza, I'll give you the final, because it seems that we always forget, right, that there are innocent people at the receiving end of any country's such policies.
Yes, that's a part which was ignored perhaps in this war. This war, which was basically designed to so-called politically, at least was designed to basically eliminate terrorism, not only basically increase the radicalism and terrorism, but also expanded the American empire and reinforced the Pentagon and basically created new industries such as homeland security industries. Rather, the missing part here is millions of people who are displaced and millions of people who have a very difficult time living in the refugee camps, a lot of them risking their lives to get to the safe places, such as, for example, in Europe. A lot of people are concerned about the Europe's security, Europe's geopolitical risk, but nobody is concerned about these people who doesn't have basically a voice to be heard in this equation.
Very well. We'll leave there as a third, but we sincerely appreciate all three of our guests for their time and for speaking to us here in Scope. That was Reza speaking to us from Tehran, Nina speaking to us this morning from New York, and Kerstin speaking to us from Cardiff. Now, as I put to all of our guests, we always forget that at the end of arms deals, at the end of this war on terror, at the receiving end will always be innocent humans. And we can name it whatever we want. We can name it collateral damage. But even as the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has pointed out to the world numerous times, that even this country has suffered a lot because of the war on terror, the displacement of people, the killing of innocent people. All of the above does no favors to any country which in fact wants to defeat terrorism, because it in fact creates more desperation, and that's just a natural consequence of that sort of atrocity. So this has been, for all intents and purposes, catastrophic. These arms deals need to end. These arms companies, strength and influence over policy making, be it in the United States, the UK, or any other such country in the Western world or anywhere else in the world, even if we're talking about the Russians or others, that needs to end. We need to have less wars. We need to have more peace, and in fact, more strength and money to be put towards peace as well. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss that ongoing investigation into atrocities by the Myanmar army towards Rohingyas in Myanmar itself. That investigation, of course, being carried out by the International Court of Justice as well as the International Criminal Court. Now, there has been a significant development in this case where two soldiers who deserted from the Myanmar army have in fact admitted on video, have essentially their confessions videos of the fact that they did kill and rape Muslim Rohingya villagers according to orders that they were given by their superiors. Now, this again goes along the narrative that we've been told by many experts around the world into the case of the Rohingya about the fact that the Myanmar army from the top down is the one who has been supporting the sorts of atrocities that we've seen play out on the ground in Rakhine State as well as elsewhere in that country, and that has resulted, of course, then in so many Rohingya having to leave the country towards countries like Bangladesh or others as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further and how significant this may be a development in this case. We're now joined by Dr. Costas Laoutides, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Deakin University. He's also the co-author of Myanmar's Rohingya conflict. He's joining us now from Melbourne. Joining us from Cardiff is Dr. Palash Kamruzzaman, who is a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of South Wales. He's leading an interdisciplinary research currently into violence and loss of dignity among forcibly displaced Rohingyas in Bangladesh. And joining us from Copenhagen is Dr. Kerstin Bree Carlson, who is an associate professor at the Department of Law at the University of Southern Denmark. Kerstin, Palash, and Costas, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Palash, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of these videos of these soldiers? How significant a development is it to have soldiers themselves admitting on tape what we all have believed to have happened on the ground?
Yes, I think it is extraordinary on many levels. So far from our research and colleagues all over the world, found similar sort of evidence. People have been saying that it's not the victims while they have investigated by themselves. And our research team included, that we have found these narratives to be similar to what the soldiers are saying. So it will probably make a strong case to take it up to a level where, when authenticated, one can claim that state-led violence, ethnic cleansing did actually happen in Myanmar, that Myanmar has been denying for a while.
Costas, what your thoughts are on this? Do you think that the tide is changing in some ways? Because, we also recently had Canada and the Netherlands say that they will assist the Gambia in its case. I mean, they're not formally joining it seemingly at this point, even though they have an intention to do so seemingly. But I mean, it seems that Myanmar is now more and more in the spotlight. Do you think at some point we might actually see accountability?
Well, I think that at some point we may see accountability on that episode of the very long Rohingya conflict in Myanmar. This year is the election year in Myanmar as well, so things will become quite complicated on that front. But what happened with the two soldiers is quite significant in the sense that more pressure will be exercised on Myanmar now to do something about this particular case, the incidents of 2017 and the accusations about mass atrocities, acts of genocide, or even genocide. It depends on what the inquiry will conclude on that. My understanding is that these two soldiers were in the custody of the Arakan Army, which is yet another, if you like, layer in the conflict, another group that fights for recognition, basically, and human rights in Rakhine State, in the very complicated conflict in Rakhine State.
Kerstin, what are your thoughts on this? How significant a step forward is this in the prosecution's case there at the ICJ? I mean, is this a huge win for the Gambia in that case?
For the Gambia, I'm not sure. I think there are sort of interesting questions. Mostly, I think for the International Criminal Court, this is really significant. For the Gambia, we already had, as the other speakers have mentioned, we already had some pretty significant UN reports. So we know a lot about what's happened. So this really has, I think, a lot to do with credibility and then the question of how cases move forward. So previously in international criminal law, the UN Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia sort of got kickstarted by a confession of a soldier who had participated in Srebrenica. And using Erdemovich's confession, he later pleaded guilty. Many facts about the Srebrenica genocide came to light, starting with where bodies were buried, starting with how it worked. And several cases at the ICTY then focused on Srebrenica. So we've seen in the past how confessions of this sort can be extraordinarily important. And then, of course, as people mentioned, it also puts the focus back on Myanmar and what's happening. So I think this has been a big part of what the benefit of the Gambia case at the ICJ was to open up the question of, is this a local problem or is this an international problem? And of course, the same thing happens when the International Criminal Court investigates.
You know, Palash, the one thing that I've never been able to get beyond, and maybe you can help me out with this, is that, you know, we have this international law angle on all of this, right? What's happening in Myanmar, but then there's the political reality on the ground within the country as well, right? The narrative, which is so anti-Rohingya. How does one move beyond that politically? Because it seems like all political parties, or most political parties on the ground in Myanmar, are sort of in agreement in their anti-Rohingya stances.
Well, I think this has been a historical xenophobia. So that's why I was trying to refer that they have been used as a colonial and post-colonial pawns, right? There is a widespread denial of their citizenship, and yes, it is that there is a unity among the local politicians in Myanmar, and they use the derogatory language of use kala. It's pretty much like foreigner, xenophobic, and similar to blacks, right? Blacks in that context. So you see that this is a systematic, widespread social and state-led crime that has been supported by local people and politicians as well.
So Costa, do you think that international justice helps that situation on the ground? Because, you know, I feel like in some senses, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if we have more international pressure on Myanmar, that it can go the opposite way, right? Where they can just dig in their heels in their anti-Rohingya stances and sort of stick by that.
Well, this is very correct in the sense that it has to be a very calibrated and very balanced act. Nobody should deny justice to Rohingya. There is no question about that. I don't think that this is the issue. I think the issue is that the international community needs to appreciate and realize how complex the situation is on the ground. The narrative that we come across for many years now is the very bipolar relation between Rohingya and the government, where in fact, and again, I'm coming back to the local Rakhine and the fight of the Arakan army. What has happened over the past 20 years is the disillusionment of local Rakhine about the relationships with the Rohingya. And I can tell you that from my fieldwork there, we have established that there are a lot of connections between local Rakhine and local Rohingya who run completely counter to the established narrative of an ultimate clash between the two populations. To a large extent, the Myanmar government has capitalized on that. So we have to be extremely cautious to try and target individuals who are responsible and accountable rather than trying to collectively hold accountable communities. Because within the communities, there are connections, there are good connections. I'm not saying that the relationship between the local Rakhine and the Rohingya is 100% excellent, but there has been connections, there are connections there. There was a lot of fear in the past because of the government pressure. Now things are opening up a little bit, just a little bit, but I can say that we have to be extremely cautious and not branding communities as good, bad, or evil.
That's a very good point, Kerstin, because as I put to the other guests, this seems like a very delicate balancing act, right, where you have the international law angle. Certainly Rohingya deserve justice. They deserve to live in their own homeland as they have for so many generations. How does one balance law and political realities on the ground in this fashion?
Yeah, that's really the big question. I would say that one of the things that was interesting about the Gambia case had to do with the way that Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi came to The Hague to defend her country. And of course, this got a lot of attention at the time. She'd had the Peace Prize. She'd been celebrated as a leader of democracy. And so a lot of the international furor over this had to do with how can someone who was for so long celebrated as a force for democracy find herself at the head of a state or part of a series of genocidal moves and then defending that state. And so I think it is significant that she came, right? She, in fact, didn't recognize the crimes against humanity, the genocide. She didn't recognize these facts on the ground, but she did come. And so I think that capacity, that's evidence, in fact, of pressure, right? So, and a lot of the way that international criminal law works is to draw attention, to insist that something's not simply a tragedy or simply sad, but in fact criminal. Because tragedies happen, but crimes should be avoided, and they should be deterred. And then when they do happen, they should be punished. So that change of approach and change of narrative is a big part of what the international system has to offer. It's part of what Gambia is drawing from when it brings its case, and it's part of course, what the International Criminal Court is designed to do. So I think we can always be hopeful that the attention and that pressure ends up mattering, right? And we've seen that in other places. It changes. Local politics can be changed coming from international pressures.
Paolo, as we're speaking, of course, and I wonder what your thoughts are on, as time goes by, if the case for those Rohingya, especially those who are outside the country, grows stronger, because, and I've asked other experts this in the past too, and I wonder what your thoughts are, because it seems to me that time is not on the side of the Rohingya, where the longer they spend outside their country, the weaker their case for citizenship becomes within the country, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it can be looked from different perspectives. Can I just, first of all, try to rephrase what you said before slightly? When you said,
Sure.
Rohingyas have been living there for many generations, why do not we say that Rohingyas have been living in that country since the beginning of this state of Myanmar, right? So that's the end of the story. They have been living there since when Myanmar was created. And the case is, when Rohingyas are outside, they can still be a force. But when they have no strong voice on their behalf, because these are one of the most vulnerable, most persecuted people on this planet without their own fault. Because I'm not sure, and neither are they probably, that what they have done, what has brought this misery on them, apart from their ethnic origin, their skin color, and their religious belief, right? So when they're outside, their case might be diminished if international community do not stand on their behalf. On the other hand, if international community, including academia, advocacy, research, and UN bodies, all is strong together for the Rohingya, not for the Rohingya, to say that, look, we stand united against the injustice that has happened against these people, then we might have a strong case. And I would emphasize that should be driven as a dignified solution for these people.
Okay.
They deserve right and due dignity as human beings wherever they are now outside their country and when they would go back to their country. We are talking about a huge number of people, almost 1 million people, and taking refuge in Bangladesh, but still some 600,000 people living inside the country, and their life is no less than miserable, like living in open prison, right? So we need to look out from a balanced perspective and taking it as a holistic picture.
Yeah, that was a very fair point. Costas, we just have under a minute left. I just wanted to get your final thoughts before I let the three of you go. On this issue of citizenship, what are your thoughts?
Well, they need a demos. The very idea that the Myanmar polity is divided on the basis of ethnicity has to change. It is a multi-ethnic society, and it has to constitute a demos which is not based on ethnicity. If we have the time, we can go, in analyzing why and how the Rohingya were excluded by the implementation of ethnicity as the core element of citizenship in Myanmar. So I think my suggestion, if you like, or my belief is that the constitution of the polity of the political community must move from ethnicity to citizenship. Ethnicity must not be a criterion about whether a person belongs to the Union of Myanmar. And this is the sticky point, if you like, the thorny issue around how the Rohingya have been excluded.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there no word, but of course we appreciate all three of our guests, Costas, Palash and Kerstin, speaking to us from Melbourne, Cardiff and Copenhagen respectively, for of course their insight and putting this into context for us, because we look at these two soldiers and their confession, and to us again it seems earth-shattering, right? But then this has, we have seen a confession before too in other cases in the past, and this has of course created waves there as well. But will this change the reality on the ground is what I keep going back to, because sure, we have the international law angle, but will that solve the situation in the country? Yes, no one is doubting the importance of the fact that Rohingya do deserve complete accountability and international justice for the crimes that have been committed against them, the rapes, the killings, etc., them being removed from their homes forcibly and, forced to even flee the country, their own country, as Palash correctly, pointed out to me as well. So we'll keep a very close eye on this, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Gaza, and international development agencies have now sounded the alarm, as they have for a while now, about the blockade/siege that has been in place on Gaza by Israel as well as the Egyptians for the past 13 plus years. Now speaking about the situation and the context of coronavirus and the fact that that virus has now begun spreading within the Gazan population. There are worries about what could be a catastrophic outbreak at this point in time in that territory. Now, the Association of International Development Agencies has warned that Gaza's deep and protracted humanitarian crisis threatens to intensify rapidly. That's an exact quote, as these virus cases increase on a daily basis. Now, Israel, despite its obligations as an occupying power within the international law, has not in fact come to a plan to how to deal with the virus within the Gaza Strip as well, which is, again, obviously against us as international law. Physicians for Human Rights Israel has said Israel is, in fact, it tightened the criteria for patients to be able to enter the West Bank and other territories for treatment, be it about coronavirus or other such illnesses as well. Let's discuss all of the above a bit further. We're now joined by Neil Sammonds, who is the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns, the Medical Aid for Palestinians. He was in Gaza last January, but he's currently joining us from London. Neil, thank you very much for your time today. Tell us about your thoughts about what coronavirus within the context of Gaza means. I mean, of course, we always talk about the fact that this is an extremely congested territory. It's been under blockade for many years, so, resources are few to go around.
Yes, as you say, Waqar, this is something which the Association of International Development Agencies, of whom Medical Aid for Palestinians is one of scores of members, sounded the alarm about several days ago. It's something which we and people in Gaza have been, frankly, terrified would be happening soon, and now it looks like the outbreak is really taking off. This morning, we've had it reported that nearly 200 new cases of infection have been recorded. There was the death of a 6-month-old baby. That brings the deaths to 10. Now, Gaza, as you indicate, is so particularly vulnerable here. And those vulnerabilities, let me point out, they're very much man-made. The vulnerabilities of Gaza come from the fact that, of course, 76% of the population of Gaza, that's 2 million people living in that area, are refugees. Those are people who've been blocked from returning to the lands and homes from which they were forced to flee during the Nakba some 70-odd years ago. There are 10 refugee camps where already last week it became known that all had community-based transmission taking part in them. Gaza itself is densely populated. The refugee camps are even more densely populated. And of course, you've got multi-generational households living together. You've got high levels of non-communicable diseases, very high rates of malnutrition. More than 50% of the population is below the poverty line. It's got some of the highest unemployment and underemployment levels in the world. Yeah. Picture yourself as being perhaps like someone with disabilities or someone with other challenges in life. You will almost certainly be unemployed, and you will have very big challenges to stand up to another attack like COVID. The health sector, let's look at that. So already before this current crisis, it had to withstand 3 large-scale military offensives from the Israeli authorities. Its hospitals and clinics, ambulances and workers were attacked, as always the case, or almost always the case with Israeli authorities and military forces, with absolute impunity. Several more health workers were killed during the course of the Great March of Return, in which thousands of unarmed protesters were shot, particularly in their legs. The health workers themselves are overstretched. We're hearing daily of new challenges. So, for example, the 2 leading NICU, the intensive care units for neonatals, one has had to close due to illnesses or COVID infection of its staff. All have been now put into El Shifa Hospital. There's 48 that I've been in that unit myself. That's putting extra strain on the workers. And that
okay, so if I may just come in, Neil, I appreciate putting that into context for us, because again, I think that there are many times that we don't actually completely appreciate what the situation is like on the ground there in the Gaza Strip, right? But I wonder, as far as the obligations that Israel has at this point in time, right? And it's had these obligations even when the blockade begun, and obviously the blockade in and of itself is illegal by itself. But even in this situation of the coronavirus, there doesn't seem to actually be a plan on how to deal with this. I imagine the Hamas authorities that rule Gaza at this point in time can only do so much, considering they have limited access to resources, right?
Yes, you're right. Israel continues to be the occupying power in Gaza, even though it withdrew its settlements, but it has absolute control over entrance in and out of Gaza. That includes for patients, for health workers, for humanitarian supplies. Egypt, as you mentioned in your introduction, has other obligations because it's a neighbor. It's not the occupying power, which is also blockading Gaza. The blockade itself, the blockade of closure, is something which UN Secretary Generals, other UN bodies, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Crescent have called collective punishment. Israel is in profound breach of its international obligations with regards to the health of the Palestinians, as stated by UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Professor Michael Link. In times of a pandemic, under the Geneva Convention, the occupying power has even more obligations to ensure that the population under its control has access to all the necessary equipment, supplies, medications, and so on. That is not happening. And as you said, there have been long-standing concerns and violations of Palestinian patients and health workers in their freedom of movement and, of course, of supplies into Gaza. And the pandemic is exposing them even more. It's highly unjust, and the blockade itself must end, and Israel must do much more to support the population. It's putting the obligation onto the international community to support the Palestinian health sector when it should be doing it itself.
Neil, as a final, before I let you go, I wonder, the politics here is important, certainly, right? Because you well know, of course, the differences between Hamas and Israeli authorities. And there's always back and forth about who is the one being provocative, incendiary balloons. Rockets, airstrikes by Israel, as you said, 3 invasions on this very small territory. But on top of that, this is collective punishment, is it not? Or is that an overstatement, just to say that this is collective punishment upon those 2 million people who probably just want to live in peace? Absolutely.
Yeah, as I said, it's the collective punishment is something which is not used enough by the international community, and particularly those with most influence, especially the Security Council. As I said, the UN Secretary General has called it collective punishment and that it must end. The International Committee of the Red Cross and Crescent calls it collective punishment. That was years ago that they have said that. But we find that there is generally a lack of will, for political reasons or otherwise, we don't know, it's not really clear, for many states and other influential powers to call this out upon Israel. It's collective punishment. 2 million people are suffering unimaginable hardship because of the blockade, which is the heart in many ways of people's suffering in Gaza. And it really is high time that it was lifted.
Very well, Neil. We'll leave the final word, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking out time out of your busy schedule to speak to us today. Neil Sammonds there speaking to us from London. He's the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns and Medical Aid for Palestinians. Now, of course, as Neil there mentioned, this is collective punishment, as it's called by many experts around the world, what is happening to Gazans, Palestinians there in the Gaza Strip. 13 plus years of a blockade, and now we have coronavirus within this territory. No plan as such on the part of the Israeli occupying authorities, who are bound legally, international law, according to international law, that is, to deal with the situation, to have a plan in place to ensure that these occupied peoples are given proper access to health care, etc. How can that happen, though, when Physicians for Human Rights Israel is saying that, in fact, at this point in time, it seems Israel has tightened criteria for who it allows into its territories or into the greater occupied West Bank as well. We'll keep, of course, a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.